I never meant for it to become anything more than a friendship. At least, that's what I told myself in the beginning. She was older, poised in a way that comes only from time, and a few heartbreaks survived. The kind of woman who didn't need to fill silences. She made them feel safe. We met on an ordinary afternoon. I was helping organize a small community event, and she was there volunteering, sleeves rolled up, her hair loosely tied back. There was something disarming about the way she carried herself, calm, deliberate, with that quiet confidence that doesn't ask for attention, yet somehow gathers it anyway. Our first conversation wasn't anything special. Weather, schedules, a passing joke about the terrible coffee they served. But even then, there was a softness in her tone that stayed with me long after I walked away. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other, in hallways, during late cleanups, at the small cafe across from the park. Every time, it felt natural to talk a little longer. She listened differently from most people my age, not waiting for her turn to speak, but really hearing you. And when she did speak, her words carried weight, the kind that lingers and makes you think about them later in quiet moments. I started noticing the smaller things, the faint scent of jasmine she wore, the way her eyes softened when she laughed, the faint lines near her mouth that deepened when she smiled. Signs of a life lived fully, beautifully. Sometimes when we stood close, I could feel the warmth from her hand brush against mine, accidental but never unacknowledged. Those small touches felt like entire conversations we weren't ready to have. I tried to tell myself it was admiration, maybe gratitude, nothing more. But affection has a way of slipping past reason, doesn't it? It hides in the pauses between words, in shared glances that last a second too long. One evening, after everyone had left, we sat outside under the soft amber lights strung across the courtyard. The air was cool, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without thinking, I offered my jacket. She hesitated, smiled that quiet smile of hers, and accepted. Our hands brushed as she took it, and for a brief, fragile moment, neither of us moved. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. There was something honest in that silence, the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. I never meant to fall for her, but somewhere between our quiet talks and that unguarded smile I did. And maybe, just maybe, she felt it too, in the way her eyes lingered when she handed my jacket back, as if saying some things are better felt than spoken. She had that kind of laugh that filled a space without asking permission. Soft at first, then bright enough to make people turn their heads. It wasn't the laugh of someone trying to charm. It was the sound of someone who'd learned how to find light in places most people overlook. I used to think of her as someone passing through my orbit, someone I'd see, talk to politely, and then move on from. But the more time we spent together, the less distance there seemed to be. She had a way of drawing people in, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing to prove. We worked in the same office. She handled design, I handled content. Our desks weren't far apart, but it wasn't proximity that connected us. It was the rhythm of small things. Morning coffee breaks, shared playlists, the way she'd lean over to show me a sketch, her hair brushing my shoulder as she pointed to the details. Each of those moments was brief, ordinary, yet they lingered far longer than each path. She was older, but she never wore it like a difference. There was no condescension, no line drawn between our worlds. Instead, she treated me as if I belonged, as if my ideas mattered, even when I stumbled through them. And I, without meaning to, began to crave her approval. Sometimes I'd catch her looking out the window during late afternoons, eyes half lost in thought, the fading sunlight catching the fine lines near them. There was a quiet melancholy in her expression, the kind that comes from knowing too well how temporary things can be. I wanted to ask what she was thinking, but I never did. It felt too personal, too close to something sacred. One evening, the office had mostly emptied out. She stayed behind to finish a layout. I stayed because I didn't want to leave her alone in that dim golden light. Music played softly from her laptop, something instrumental, delicate. She stretched her arms, sighed, and smiled at me. "You're still here?" she asked, voice low, almost teasing. "I could say the same to you." I replied. She laughed, that same unguarded laugh, and the sound echoed against the quiet walls. I didn't realize I was smiling until she noticed and tilted her head, curious. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "Just it's good to hear you laugh." Her gaze softened for a moment, warm, unreadable. Then she looked back at her screen. But the air between us had shifted. The distance we'd carefully kept suddenly felt fragile, thin. She wasn't supposed to matter this much. I had told myself that a dozen times. But sitting there, watching the glow of her monitor trace the outline of her face, I knew I was already too far gone. And maybe, in the way her smile lingered when she said goodnight, she knew it too. It was such a small gesture that day, barely a second long, but I remember it as if it just happened. Her hand on my shoulder, light and steady, grounding me in a way words couldn't. I've been struggling to find my footing, a bad week, too much pressure, and the quiet kind of exhaustion that hides behind polite smiles. She noticed before I even said a word. She always noticed. Her name was Clara, a woman with a calm presence that filled the spaces around her without ever demanding them. There was something unhurried about her, a patience that came from understanding life's uneven rhythm. She didn't rush people, didn't try to fix everything. She just saw you. I was younger, still learning how to carry myself in a world that often felt too loud, too fast. Clara had already learned how to slow down. She made coffee like a ritual, spoke softly but with purpose, and somehow, even her silence felt kind. The first time we really talked was after a meeting that had gone badly. I stayed behind, staring at my notes, pretending to be fine. She walked past, paused, then came back. "You don't have to get everything right the first time," she said gently. "You just have to keep trying." When I looked up, she smiled. Not the kind meant to cheer me up, but the kind that says I understand. Then she rested her hand briefly on my shoulder. Just a touch. Simple, but it steadied something in me that had been shaking for a while. After that day, I started noticing her more, the faint scent of her perfume, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the quiet hum she made while reading emails. We began to share coffee breaks, small conversations that stretched into longer ones. Sometimes, when we talked, I'd catch her eyes softening, like she was seeing through my words to the person behind me. Other times, when the office lights dimmed in the evening, we'd sit across from each other in comfortable silence, the only sound the tapping of keyboards and the hum of the air conditioner. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confessions, no sudden spark. It was something gentler, a warmth that built slowly, quietly, until I realized I looked forward to her presence more than anything else. Weeks passed, and one evening, as we stood by the window watching the city lights, she turned to me and smiled. "You seem lighter these days," she said. "Maybe I've had good company," I replied. Her eyes lingered on mine a moment longer than they should have, and the space between us seemed to breathe. Nothing more happened, but it didn't need to. The moment itself said enough, a truth we both felt but didn't name. It had started with simple kindness, and somehow, it had become everything I couldn't stop thinking about. The first time I saw her, she wasn't doing anything remarkable, just sitting by the window of a small cafe, reading. The late afternoon light was pouring in, catching strands of silver in her hair, turning them gold. There was a calm about her, not stillness exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty, like she'd long stopped needing to rush through life. I was there for a meeting that got canceled at the last minute. She was there for reasons I didn't know yet. When our eyes met, a brief, unplanned glance, she smiled. Not politely, not distantly, but in a way that felt warm and real. It wasn't the kind of smile that invites conversation, yet somehow it made me want to say something anyway. When I finally did, it was something simple, a comment about the book she was reading. She looked up, surprised, and for a second I wondered if I'd interrupted her piece. But then she tilted her head, the corners of her lips softening. "You've read it?" she asked. That's how it began. A few words about literature turned into minutes, minutes into a shared table. She spoke thoughtfully, her voice low and smooth, like someone who'd spent years listening more than speaking. I found myself watching her gestures, the way she traced the rim of her cup as she thought, the faint laugh lines that appeared when she smiled. She carried years of grace in her eyes. You could see in the way she noticed things, how she paid attention to the rain starting outside, to the rhythm of the street beyond the glass, to the small pauses in our conversation. I was 20-something, full of restlessness and ambition. She was everything opposite, grounded, composed, her presence like a calm tide against my uncertainty. The age between us wasn't something I thought about then, but I felt it, not as distance, but as depth. We began to meet often, always by accident at first. The same cafe, the same corner. Then, after a while, not by accident anymore. She told me about her garden, her love of quiet mornings, the music she played when she couldn't sleep. I told her about my work, my hopes, the small fears I didn't voice to anyone else. There was no pretense between us, just quiet understanding, the kind that happens when two people stop trying to impress and simply begin to be. One evening, as we left the cafe, she paused under the streetlight. The rain had just stopped. Her hair clung lightly to her face. She laughed softly, brushing it back, and looked at me. "You remind me of how I used to dream," she said. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled, feeling something shift quietly inside me. The awareness that she wasn't just someone I admired. She was someone I was beginning to care for, deeply. And as we walked in opposite directions that night, I realized I was already thinking of the next time I'd see her, the next small, ordinary moment that might change everything. There's never a moment when you know for sure. No sudden spark, no grand realization. It just happens quietly. One day you're talking to someone, sharing small jokes and borrowed time, and then one morning you wake up realizing that the thought of them has found a permanent place in your mind. That's how it was with her. We met through a mutual friend at a local photography class. I wasn't there to make connections. I just wanted to learn, keep myself occupied. She was already there when I walked in, setting up her camera with a calm focus that made the whole room seem slower. There was grace in the way she moved, the kind that comes from living deliberately, not rushing anything. At first, we only spoke in passing. Small talk about lenses, light, the weather. But she had this way of listening that made every reply feel meaningful, even when it wasn't. Over time, our conversations stretched longer. After class, over coffee, during evening walks by the river. She told me about her life in fragments, little glimpses that hinted at years of love, loss, and quiet resilience. There was a depth in her eyes when she spoke about the past, the kind that only comes from having lived through both joy and grief. I never asked too many questions. Some stories you don't need to hear fully to understand their weight. I don't know when I started noticing the smaller details, the faint scent of rain in her hair, the softness in her laugh when she was truly at ease, the way she'd reach out and lightly touch my wrist when she wanted to make a point. Those moments seemed to live longer than they should have, echoing quietly after they ended. One evening, we were sitting on a park bench, the sun dipping low, painting everything in amber light. She was telling me about a place she used to visit with her friends years ago, how the air smelled of pine and sea salt. Her voice slowed as she spoke, and for a while, she just looked at the horizon. Then, almost without thinking, she rested her hand over mine. It wasn't a deliberate gesture, not something rehearsed or self-conscious. It was natural, two people sharing the same quiet, the same warmth. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The world felt still. No one tells you how quietly it happens, how affection turns into something deeper, something that hums beneath your skin. She turned to me and smiled softly, her thumb brushing lightly against my hand before she withdrew it. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. We walked back together in silence, the kind that feels full rather than empty. And even though we didn't name it, not then, not out loud, I think we both knew. Some feelings don't need words. They just grow quietly until they're all you can feel. Some people come into your life quietly. No fanfare, no sudden storm. They just appear, and somehow, you never remember what things felt like before them. That's how it was with her. We met through work, a collaborative project that was supposed to last 3 weeks. She joined as a consultant, calm and self-assured, with a confidence that made people listen before she even said much. The first time we spoke, I noticed how steady her voice was, low and even, but with a kind of warmth that softened every word. She was older, though she never seemed it, not in the way she carried herself. There was a vitality about her, something both grounded and quietly alive. She made everything feel lighter, easier. And before I knew it, I was timing my mornings around when she'd arrive, pretending coincidence when it wasn't. We spent long hours side by side, reviewing documents, planning meetings, trading small jokes that only we found funny. It wasn't the kind of closeness that asked for attention. It simply existed, steady and effortless. Sometimes, when we'd both be looking at the same laptop screen, our shoulders would touch. Just slightly. A small thing, barely a moment. But every time, it felt like the world held its breath. Neither of us moved away. There was something about her presence. Not electric, but grounding. When I was near her, I felt centered, like I didn't need to fill every silence with noise. She had a way of making stillness feel comfortable, even meaningful. One evening, after a long day, we lingered in the office long after everyone else had left. The lights were dim, and outside, rain pressed softly against the windows. She sighed, leaning back in her chair, eyes half closed. "Tired?" I asked. "Just the kind of tired that comes from caring too much," she said with a faint smile. Then she looked at me, really looked, as if seeing past the words I hadn't said. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she added quietly. "Someone good, I hope?" I asked, try to sound light. Her smile deepened, bittersweet. "Someone kind." That silence that followed, it wasn't awkward. It was full. There was a weight to it, something understood but unspoken. I could feel it in the space between us, in the soft hum of the rain outside, in the warmth that gathered quietly in my chest. She stood up after a moment, gathering her things. Before she left, she touched my arm, just her fingertips brushing the fabric of my sleeve. "You should go home too," she said. I nodded, but I didn't move until long after she'd gone. It was never about how close we stood, but how neither of us ever stepped away. And somehow, that small truth carried more meaning than anything either of us dared to say out loud. I never thought much about comfort before I met her. I'd known attraction, excitement, even infatuation, all the things people mistake for love. But this was different. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was quiet, steady, like the warmth that lingers after the sun has set. Her name was Elise. We met at a local book club, though calling it that felt generous. Most of us were just there to drink coffee and talk about everything but the book. She, on the other hand, actually read them. Every week, she'd show up early, her hair loosely pinned, a worn paperback in hand, and a calm smile that made the room feel softer. She must have been in her 40s, though it hardly mattered. What I noticed first wasn't her age, it was her ease. The way she spoke, the patience in her pauses, the way she seemed to listen with her whole being. Around her, I found myself slowing down too, speaking more thoughtfully, as if her presence demanded honesty. Our first real conversation wasn't about books at all. It was about solitude. "It's strange," she'd said, stirring her tea, "how people assume being alone means being lonely. Sometimes it's just peace." I remember smiling, surprised by how deeply that resonated. "Maybe it's just easier to be misunderstood quietly," I said. She looked at me, then really looked, and for a moment, there was no noise in the cafe, no one else in the room. Just her gaze, soft but knowing, and something unspoken settling between us. After that, we started walking home together after meetings, always taking the longer route by the river. Sometimes we talked, other times we didn't. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of small things, shared glances, the sound of her footsteps beside mine, the faint brush of her hand when our paths narrowed. One evening, it started to drizzle. I offered her my jacket, but she laughed and shook her head. "You'll catch cold," she said, reaching up to smooth a damp strand of hair from my forehead. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but my breath caught all the same. Her hand lingered for a second longer than necessary, warm against my skin, and something in me shifted, quiet, certain, irreversible. From that night on, I began to notice the small ways she had changed me. I looked forward to her laughter, her insights, the calm certainty she carried into every room. And yet, I never said anything. Maybe because I didn't want to break whatever fragile balance we'd built. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. It slips in softly, disguised as comfort, in the way she remembered how I liked my coffee, in the warmth of her voice when she said my name, in every quiet goodbye that felt just a little too reluctant. I never told her how I felt. I didn't need to. Some connections don't need to be spoken to be understood. They simply exist quietly, beautifully, in the spaces where words would only get in the way.